Hi all, I'm really excited to be speaking to you today. I'm Emily Pauley, a historian of science who works on early American history, which makes you relevant to this week. I hear you read some of my work on cattle, so some of this is going to be familiar to you, but I hope this quick talk will give you a sense of what my research process was like, maybe a little more concrete sense of what it means to see cattle the way that 19th century people do, and why that might matter for us today. So like your professor, I'm trained as a historian of science, and I'm particularly interested in how some of our knowledge comes from people we might not recognize as scientists. Apothecaries, hunters, cooks, brewers, weavers. The people I'm most interested in, though, are farmers and breeders, because most of the people in the century that I study, the 19th century, manage ecosystems for a living. So they feed one organism to another, they keep things alive, and in order to do that, they have to understand a lot about these organisms. Their knowledge has been incorporated into what we call science. Rather than going on at this general level, I want to tell you about a puzzle that I found and how it led me to this complex community that has shaped our world in a few ways. Since I'm a historian, my story starts in the archives. I was a grad student, I was studying agriculture, and I was reading some letters that were about 150 years old from the Patent Office down in DC, and I came across this weird moment. It started with what seemed like a very boring letter. In 1853, the Patent Office sent out a notice in the newspapers about their agricultural yearbook. Fascinating, right? Immediately. So every year, the Patent Office published a yearbook of agriculture, and this is the most widely circulated government document of the 19th century. They printed about 100,000 copies a year. They're great big fat books. So in this very seemingly boring letter, they wanted to know if they should print, quote, exact portraits of the best breeds of our domestic animals. So they're going to be pictures of livestock in the yearbook. Should they print pictures of animals? I have to say I was not immediately interested in this. As a government publication, should it have pictures? Should it not have pictures? I was actually looking for something else, not very exciting. But reading along, I saw that lots of people were writing back, and these people seemed very, very excited about this question of whether there would be pictures in the government's yearbook. They thought these pictures were very important. So my favorite was a very enthusiastic letter from Iowa from a guy named James W. Grimes. He ran an agricultural newspaper in Iowa. He would later be governor of Iowa, and he said that such pictures would, quote, elevate the standard of stock raising throughout the country and, in very few years, double the wealth of the nation. So I thought that's very interesting. The pictures are going to double the wealth of the nation. Seems odd. Lots of enthusiastic letters like that. Some were also terribly opposed. So Lewis F. Allen, a breeder and agricultural author in Buffalo, declared that the money spent would be, quote, worse than thrown away. Not because the pictures were not important, but actually because A, there were already lots of pictures. So there are hundreds of thousands of copy impressions already published in agricultural papers, he said. But also because, quote, there is not an artist in America who can paint a correct portrait of an animal. So this letter also convinced me this is a very important question, because what he's actually saying is here, we've put a lot of emphasis on making good portraits already, we have tons of them, and bad portraits of animals are dangerous. They didn't just get letters about it. People published editorials in the newspaper about this plan. They said things like, quote, if all the animals could be selected by impartial and competent judges, if the portraits are really accurate, right, the proposed plan would be of great service. If not, they threatened, it would be worse than nothing, as it would mislead instead of directing the public. So this was an exciting moment for me. In history, what we're really looking for quite often are the moments when people in the past do things that we don't understand at all. Because that's the moment when their culture is really different from our culture. I totally didn't understand this thing that they were doing. But I realized that it pointed out something that I had only vaguely noticed. I had been reading a lot of agricultural journals, so these are agricultural newspapers for scientifically minded farmers. I've been reading hundreds of these things. They have lots and lots of pictures of cattle. And I had kind of passed over them. I was looking for descriptions of soil fertility, and conversations about poison. And I just thought, oh, you know, pictures of cattle. But pictures in the 19th century are very important. And you can tell they're important because they're very expensive. People don't just put pictures in by mistake, right? People advertise if they've got pictures in. Also, the way that people were talking about these pictures was pretty strange. As a historian of science, I often study how different kinds of images claim to represent reality, how much they look like the thing that they're supposed to look like. And these pictures weren't just supposed to look like reality. They were supposed to change reality. Good pictures of animal bodies were supposed to make real animal bodies better. What was going on? Why did these pictures matter so much? And how were they supposed to work? So I started following it as a little sideline. Now it's kind of exploded. It's going to be my second book product, and the article that I wrote about it you have read. So in the rest of the talk, this little video today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I found. I'm going to start by talking about how cattle were changing in this period. So how we understand what these things are that are in the picture. Then I'm going to talk about the culture and meaning of animal portraits. And then I'm going to talk about why this all matters, I think. So I'm going to start with a little background on cattle. I think that cattle bodies are actually more interesting than other kinds of animals. And to get at why, I'm going to turn to a slide that I show to audiences to get them into the beginning of the esoteric world of cattle breeding. So I'm going to take you to a very basic cattle classification. Just a moment. Here it is. You probably know this already. Cows are female, bulls are male, oxen are castrated male. Part of the reason I show this slide is that I have more than once been asked, when did oxen go extinct? One of the people who asked me this question is my husband. I will never let him forget it. The main reason this is an important slide is because it reminds us how flexible the bodies of cattle are. So horses produce labor, pigs produce meat. 19th century cattle work, but they make both milk and flesh. Now these functions are differentiated. Work has dropped out. We've specialized breeds for beef and dairy. But in the 19th century, cattle bodies moved through these categories more fluidly. Beef breeds and milk breeds were not clearly separated. And both milk and work animals were eventually fattened and eaten. And we can see this in this image. Sorry, I'm looking over to my other screen to find it here. This image from the 1813 children's book, The Museum of Beasts. So this is the picture of the ox. You'll notice 19th century people often refer to cows as oxen because oxen are more important to them. So we see the multifunctionality of this body through this slightly creepy little poem, which I reiterate is for children. The ox to various toils we train, to draw the plough or tread the grain, and to reward his labours past, we kill and eat him up at last. So, cattle are different in the 19th century. 19th century breeders, the people that I'm interested in, aren't talking about cattle in general, though. They're talking about North Devons and Herefords and Ayrshires and Alderneys, and most importantly, Durham Shorthorns. These are purebreds, and to understand them, we have to turn to Britain in the 18th century, which is where purebred cattle were invented. This is where most Americans are getting not only their cattle portraits, but also cattle themselves. So, as many of you may have noticed, the breed names for cattle are all British place names. Names of breeds are a relic of a change in the meaning of the word breed. Up through the middle of the 18th century, cattle breeds in Britain are defined by geography. Cattle from different countries have developed different reputations. So, for example, a manual from the 1760s wrote that Wiltshire breeds large cattle but ill-shaped, and those bred in Lincolnshire are for the most part pied, very large and tall, and most fit for labor. These specializations had emerged gradually from the local fashion, and the local needs and the selective preferences of different groups of people. So, starting in the 1760s, though, this idea really starts to change. And when they tell the story of this change, British and American cattle breeders talked about a few founding figures, and the first of them is this man. Here he is. Robert Bakewell. So Robert Bakewell is famous for breeding sheep and cattle between the mid-18th and end of the 18th century. Bakewell creates a new breed, the improved Leicester Longhorn. Here it is. Improved Leicester Longhorns come from a place, but they're altered. It usually takes a long time to create a new breed, but Bakewell does it in one lifetime. So how does he do this? First, he moves away from earlier techniques of breeding, like selection, where you only breed from your best animals, and crossing, where you bring in good animals from a different region to breed with your animals. Instead, he moves to techniques that he's borrowed from racehorse breeders. He's doing what breeders call in and inbreeding. So in and inbreeding is inbreeding, actually. Bakewell chose a relatively small group of animals with the set qualities that he wanted, and he bred them and their descendants closely together in crosses that humans would call incest. So mother and son, father and daughter, full siblings quite frequently. Breeders know this is dangerous at the time. After lots of generations, some of the cattle are kind of damaged. But because he doesn't bring any variability in from outside the herd, the qualities he's looking for are accentuated, and he gets a remarkably uniform population. So, where other animals are categorized mainly by their place of origin, Bakewell's animals were defined by relationships to what became famous individual ancestors. Again, this is borrowed from racehorses. The thoroughbred racehorse was invented a little bit before this. And the goal in thoroughbred breeding was to recreate one of the famous imported Arabian ancestors. There are three of these: the Byerly Turk, the Godolphin Arabian, and the Darley Arabian. So they're all descended from these three male horses. That's a little bit different from cattle breeding. In cattle breeding, you're not trying to recreate something that exists elsewhere. You take local animals and you mess with their reproduction until they change a lot. These changes were Bakewell's other major contribution. Breeders credited Bakewell with a revolution in taste. He shifted away from big, heavy-framed animals to smaller, more efficient animals that made less bone and more meat. These animals were fast to maturing. They were ready for slaughter in 2 years instead of the 6 that were normal in the 18th century. And they had many practical features. For example, their horns were bent down so that you could feed them indoors in winter, kind of a new practice, without them stabbing each other. Bakewell was only one of a larger community of breeders who did this kind of thing, but he made himself very famous through clever publicity. He made friends in the newspapers, and he maintained a small museum in his family home where particularly fine joints from his more famous animals were preserved in pickle and plaster casts. Bakewell's improved shorthorns didn't last long after his death. A lot of them were unstable, but his techniques were adopted by a number of breeders. And kind of what happens with that, I will talk about in the next part of this lecture, which will be in the next video.